Okay, let's get going. And thank you very much for joining us. My name is Wim Hugo. I'm the CTO of DANS, for those of you who don't know me. Can you hear us? Yes. Okay. And we are going to discuss the EOSC PID policy this afternoon from three perspectives. FAIRCORE4EOSC is a project that has arranged for this workshop, but in collaboration with Fair Impact and with a task force on PID policy within EOSC. And each of those three initiatives have their own sort of goals and perspectives that they want to get out of the workshop. So we'll explain a little bit more about it. Jessica Parland von Essen here will be talking about Fair Impact a little bit, and Temis Somani about the PID Policy Task Force. Our program is to give you a quick overview of these three initiatives, the two projects and the task force activities, and then to have two breakouts, which I think, given the number of people in the room, is quite ambitious, but let's see how far we get. So the first breakout will talk a little bit more about PID policy, the scope of it, the kind of actors that are mentioned in the policy and whether that's adequate and sufficient and so on. And the second breakout will focus more on the policy as it stands at the moment to figure out whether these provisions in the policy are measurable, and if so, how one could measure compliance with those policy provisions. And then if there's time, hopefully there will be maybe some feedback from each of the breakouts, and then we'll give you a sense of what each of these, the two projects and the task force, will do with the results that we take from the workshop. Okay, so Temis, as I said, will tell us more about the policy task force and what they are going to do together with Tibor Kalman. So over to you, and you can just use the arrows to go up and down.
So before we have created 5 slides to let you know about the PID Policy and Implementation Task Force. So let's introduce our task force. It's It's a task force of 23 members, and during the selection we had the result is that we have 12 service providing a person from service providing organization, 1 person from research funding organization, 9 from research performing organizations, and 1 from the research community. The basic documents that we have in order to start working in our team, it's the EOSC PID policy, the EOSC PID architecture document, and our charter and the SRIA document. Since previous month or 2, we also have a common space we are using in our task force, which is the EOSC forum. So, which are the task force goals? Our main goals is to provide input to the board, starting mainly for the gaps identified in the PID ecosystem and mentioned in the SRIA. Another goal is to ensure that the EOSC objectives are followed and to implement and update the EOSC PID policy and architecture by aligning with the open source infrastructure and by building consensus with the communities. The core activities that we're trying to follow during the lifetime of our task force is to identify and describe the emerging and standardized identifiers for resource type, not yet been mentioned in the PID policy, because in the first document we have a specific number of PID types that are identified. Investigate use cases and make recommendations about global PID resolution services. And find something to discuss about the meta-resolvers, and review efforts to develop definitions for the most common EOSC data formats or building blocks, make an inventory of effort to implement an EOSC PID knowledge graph, set up the criteria, this one changes. set up the criteria against which PID services will be certified, and collect best practices for PID use cases that explain how they can use in the FAIR data management and share them with the EOSC community.
I will continue with the work we have done in the last 1 year. So the task force has a mandate of 24 months. We started our work more or less 1 year ago. However, onboarding took some time. We do our work in a structure that we start so-called focus groups around different topics. The first focus group we set up tried to map current PID-related activities in the EOSC context. This focus group tries to identify kind of PID types which might be relevant and might be the focus for EOSC, and try to create a list of PID-related projects in the broader EOSC ecosystem, and also PID providers and communities. The report is being reviewed now by the task force. Actually, we finished the review. It is being layouted, and then it will be sent out for community consultation. That will be the point of time when you can give your feedback to this report. The second focus group tries to collect community-specific use cases on the priorities the PID policy should address, and the task force as such should address. What we did here, we sent out a survey via all available channels in the task force, and we have written a report about our findings. This is also being layouted and will be sent out for community consultations in the very next time. This would be the time when you can give your feedback, and it was very helpful to us to evaluate how the priorities which Demis was showing are still seen today, because these priorities have been identified or had been identified some time ago. It seems that the priorities are still valid. Coming to the way of working, we try to reach out to the Horizon Europe projects in the broader EOSC landscape. I just showing on the table that several task force members, or more precisely the organizations and institutes of the task force members, are somehow related to the projects. The two here, FAIRCORE4EOSC and Fair Impact, which are organizing this session, are also somehow represented in the task force, and we have a monthly regular task force meeting, coordination meeting. This would be a potential candidate where we can invite domain experts and technology experts, also from the projects or also from other external parties. What we did not manage to do it well is coordinating our activities with the other task forces, because if you think about PIDs, persistent identifiers, these are somehow related to task forces which are doing work on data management in general, or sustainability and that kind of other activities. Just to finish with showing some or saying some words about the next activities. So we have the focus group A, which is going to run until the end of the task force. This is maintaining the report on PID related activities, PID types, projects which are doing PID related works. We try to keep this as a kind of a living document and include input from projects and from communities. The other working group, focus group, as I mentioned, the report is being layouted and will be sent out for public community consultation, and we are also thinking about to set up new focus groups, because we got now when the FairCore project started, we got a lot of input on Matter Resolver and how the project addresses the topic of Matter Resolver. This kind of focus group would be a way for a potential collaboration and coordinated joint work, and also other ideas we have in the pipeline, like the harmonization of PIDs, and we are still open for other suggestions. And with that, I hand over to Wim.
So any quick questions or clarifications, maybe for Dennis or Tibor?
Tibor, you said that you didn't align so well with the other task forces. Where would you have aligned if you had the chance to do it?
So we had a kind of a coordination meeting the day before yesterday with the board, with the EOSC board, and what we are trying to understand what would be the best technical way to work together with the other task forces. The EOSC Association task forces are working at the way, currently working more or less independently, quite independently. And I think after some work of, or some months of work, it is time now to synchronize the activities and have some exchange between the task forces. And the way how this exchange should happen was not quite clear for the task forces. That's the issue. It's not because we do not want to collaborate or the other task forces do not want to collaborate, but we do not have the daily input on what they are working on, and they also do not have our input on what we are working on.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I think Jessica should maybe let me go next. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit more about FAIRCORE4EOSC. We of course have an ecosystem of research data and related services in EOSC. Some of them envisaged, some of them already there. That will enhance the seamless access to and reliable reuse of FAIR research objects, including data, publications, code, and so on. And after the creation of the Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda, some of the priorities highlighted would be the establishment of a web of FAIR data and the minimum viable EOSC by 2027. And FAIRCORE4EOSC is directly focusing on achieving some of these objectives by establishing a number of components and services. So it's addressing broad-based challenges in respect of persistent identifiers, how we work with metadata and ontologies. Some services are aiming to improve interoperability. And then also very important, I would think, is mechanisms to bring research software more closely into our activities around referencing, citation, being able to reliably preserve it and find it again in the future. So I think that would be quite an important achievement for FAIRCORE4EOSC. So that's just a little bit of background on the project itself. The budget is 10 million euro. We should finish by May 2025. There are 22 partners coordinated by CSC. Tommy Suominen there at the back is the man who carries all the responsibility and the weight on his shoulders for looking after FAIRCORE4EOSC. And the website information, of course, is available for you in the presentations that are publicly shared. It will develop and deliver 9 different components: a research discovery graph, a PID graph, And I must say that many of these services already exist in one way or another in our ecosystem, but the intention of FAIRCORE for EOSC is to formally include them into the EOSC ecosystem so that they are part and parcel of what people can expect within EOSC. There's also a metadata schema registry and a crosswalk registry, which I think will be very, very useful. Many of the services that we are envisaging need a data type registry to function properly, because we need to be in a position to reliably refer to all kinds of both simple and composite types. There's a meta resolver that Tibor has referred to, Temis has referred to. Then what we are going to dwell on quite a bit today, the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, which in the context of this project, or the FAIRCORE for EOSC project, focuses only on measuring and encoding compliance with a PID policy, but we are expressly building this in such a way that other kinds of compliance, such as fair compliance or compliance with trustworthy repository requirements, or even potentially the provisions for participating in EOSC can be encoded and stored with using the same approach. There's something else that is potentially very useful, and that is RAID, the Research Activity Identifier Service, which is essentially persistent identifiers for grant-based and funded projects that bring together all the information that you typically would want in terms of the researchers involved, the institutions, the outputs that they have generated in time. There's also research software APIs and connectors, which in broad terms would integrate the kind of services obtainable from software heritage more closely into our ecosystem. And then there's also assistance to provide a mirror for security and sustainability and long-term preservation to software heritage, so that there is some failover and continuity provisions. So that's the FAIRCORE for EOSC project in a nutshell. The next slide is very complicated. We don't have time to look at it in detail, but in our Compliance Assessment Toolkit, we are trying to develop a vocabulary to describe the kinds of things that we typically associate with compliance in a consistent way, so that we can model, for instance, fair compliance, compliance with a PID policy, compliance with the provisions for trustworthy repositories and so on, using the same language. So it means that we have to start thinking about the meaning of things like principles, criteria, benchmarks, best practices, recommendations, methods of measurement, the mechanisms or the metrics that we gather from these mechanisms for measurement, and put them in a proper ontology, as it were, with proper relations between them. And we are hoping that by evaluating as many use cases as possible, we can develop this ontology to be a guiding principle for implementation, so that one can reliably describe all kinds of compliance assessment efforts, and potentially, where there are overlaps and links between them, get information that are pertinent to a certain topic across the board. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the breakout session. Okay, Jessica.
Okay, so I'm Jessica Palma from CSC, and I'm responsible for a work package in Fair Impact that also concerns PIDs, or where we work with the PIDs. And I think it was good that Wim presented first, because we are sort of sister projects, many same partners, but also we share the same interests and targets. But while FAIRCORE for EOSC is creating more like practical solutions and building these services, Fair Impact is sort of maybe a sort of a continuation of the FAIR project. Maybe you might be familiar with that. So we are more working with like the soft side, the implementation, the cultural change, finding good practices, sharing knowledge, and this kind of things. So yeah, so we are the same same size, and also started last summer, and are, as mentioned, a coordination and support action. Formally, our objective is to realize FAIR EOSC by supporting the implementation of FAIR and enabling practices across scientific communities and research outputs at a European, national and institutional level. So we will be doing, for instance, currently we have I really highly recommend you visit our webpage. We have, for instance, there a FAIR implementation framework, which we are collecting now, so you can submit or suggest ideas for good solutions. And what we want to do is share these solutions, for instance, across domains and collect like good tools and practices. And then we will also have calls, open calls for implementing these. So keep an eye out. Here you see the whole consortium, which is quite large, and we also work with integrated use cases also in the PID work package. So we really want to have and facilitate this discussion with the users, end users. And here you see the structure of our project. So we have these pillar themes like the persistent identifiers, metadata and ontologies, and metric certification and guidelines. And then we have the cross-cutting work packages 6 and 2. And work package 2 is the one working with the open calls and the engagement and the integrated use cases. And then we have dissemination and project management. So this is the structure, and just for a bit further context. So this is our work package, and you can see this pie chart show the members or participating partners. And you see the task 3.1 is very clear task, setting up a coordination mechanism for EOSC PID service providers. And we will be having another workshop around this tomorrow. Please join that too. And then task 3.2 is working with the PID use cases, and we are thinking and looking at things like reproducibility and different contexts, and trying to find these kinds of solutions and describe them and find ways to share them across domains. It's really, really interesting. And the point is that also this task can then feed in requirements, for instance, to the service provider community. And then we have task 3.3, which is the workshop we're having today, working on EOSC PID policy alignment and support, actually led by Dans. And then we have the PID implementation program, which hasn't started yet, but it will then start supporting the implementation. So here's the task description, just for context for what we are doing today. What this task is about is thinking about like implementing the PID policy, what it actually means in practice for different kinds of stakeholders, and then also communicating this with the assessment toolkit and bridging these activities and communicate. This
that's for next, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
All right, any questions for myself or Jessica about the projects themselves, any clarifications or things that are not crystal clear at the moment? It's a very quick overview, so I'm sure there are questions, and we're of course available to answer them afterwards. Okay, so in preparation for our 2 breakouts then, in the one breakout number 2, FAIRCORE4EOSC is more interested in understanding how people think we should be measuring compliance with the policy provisions, because once we have a policy and people have to somehow comply with that policy, we have to have ways and means of establishing whether a service provider or an end user or somebody that implements it in their infrastructure are compliant with the policy. Fair Impact is more interested in Breakout 1 in determining whether the current provisions in the policy are adequate, whether the kinds of actors that are described in there is sort of aligned with the community's expectations. So your feedback on these kinds of questions will be sought in Breakout 1. And then, of course, both of these outputs go back to the task force as one event of community consultation that they can then evaluate and see whether any changes or improvements or refinements to the policy would be required. And at probably an iterative process over the next 2 years or so. Your mandate only runs into sometime next year, I would think. So hopefully by the time when the task force charter ends, we will be in a position to say this is a fairly stable set of policy provisions, and the way in which we're going to measure it has been cleared up. So this is the first step in a journey, I would say. Okay, so to organize the breakouts then, and you will see lorem ipsum quite often in this presentation, because the one that we've put all our care and effort into is not the one that is on the folder used by the EOSC symposium. So we'll make sure that the right one replaces this one for public consumption after the session. Okay, so Jessica, I think since I'm already set up here, we have another room. So is it okay for you to use the other room, or should we swap out?
I can go there, but maybe I could, if I could chat quickly.
Yes, so quickly just chat about the sessions, and then we'll split up into two breakouts to take it forward.
Very briefly.
Okay.
So now the idea is that well, as you know, the PID landscape is very complicated and complex. There are many services and systems, and the roles are very, very different. And we have been thinking that there are the concept of a PID policy is maybe not clear for or a part of people's natural work, but actually PID policies should be done by organizations, infrastructure, research project, data service providers, maybe national policies. All these play a part actually, and they should maybe as part of their data policy or for some other reasons, they should make decisions about PIDs and the roles and how they use them, and also address these questions. So the idea is now to look at the PID, the roles described in the PID policy document, which are here. So, and I will have a cheat sheet for you, because we will be running a Mentimeter and voting for these responsibilities. So there's the authority, who is the controller for setting up this whole like schemas and systems and rules. Then we have the PID service providers, which actually like then hands out these PIDs, provision them and ensure that the resolvers are working and stuff. And then we have the PID manager, which in often wise can be a repository, for instance, which have and these are the parties that have the responsibility to maintain the integrity of the relationship. Sorry, thanks. And then we have the PID owners, who are sort of maybe the end users, or can be also the organizations, who's responsible for the correctness of the information, and then like the metadata and stuff. And then we have the end users. So these are the roles. But I will have the cheat sheet for you. And then we also have created a concept board, where you can comment on the different requirements that Wim has picked out, or your group has picked out from the policy. So we will be looking at those.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So the second breakout will remain here then. So we'll be looking a little bit more at the specifics. The PID policy provisions are handled in breakout 1. And then what we're going to do in Breakout 2 is to look at each of the current policy provisions in a bit more detail, and then look at a tentative schema that we've set up for saying what are the ways in which you can potentially measure these things. And there are quantitative measures. It should read qualitative at the top, and then quantitative measures that I'll explain a little bit more when we start in the breakout. And we will one by one go through the current provisions and see whether it's measurable at all, and if it is, which of these kinds of measurements would potentially be usable to determine compliance one way or another. So it's a little bit more of a technical exercise, but your inputs would be very welcome, because one of the feedback points might be to go back to the task force to say, yeah, the intent of this provision is okay, but you need to reformulate it in such a way that it can be measured. So that that would be a valid response also from us. Okay, so I don't know how we want to split up, maybe just in terms of the room itself. So Jessica, maybe you can pick a half, and I'll remain with the rest. Yeah, I mean, if you want to self-nominate, that's also fine. So everybody that wants to go with Jessica. Yeah. Perfect.
I am with the support organization. We are also with the panelists. We will ask them yes. No, it's different. So
This is Breakout 2 then, looking in more detail at the provisions of the policy. Okay, so we have about 25 or 26 of these provisions, and we have about 40 minutes to wade through them. So hopefully we can be reasonably efficient. But let's see how it goes. We can always try and get more time afterwards if need be. So just to explain what we mean by the different kinds of measures. A simple review is basically a qualitative review where some reviewer looks at what somebody has provided as evidence that they are in compliance, and they make some determination based on their experience, but there isn't much for them to use as guidelines on how to make the decision. They basically just take it. Somebody asks them whether they think this organization is compliant with the provision, and they say yes or no. A guided review has a little bit more information about how to assess somebody by giving examples and so on. And a benchmark review is like a guided review, but where you have very pertinent examples to say, if someone is doing this, then they are at a maturity level of 1, and if they are doing this and this and this, then they are at the next maturity level, and so on and so forth. So there are benchmarks associated with those guidelines. And as a matter of interest, something like a court-seal assessment of compliance with their criteria for a trustworthy repository operates on this benchmark review principle. So it goes with benchmarks to multiple reviewers, and then they look at the consensus coming back from that review panel in terms of compliance. And then there's, of course, something such as subjective ranking, where you can ask someone just arbitrarily on a scale of 1 to 10, how good do you think the level of compliance of this organization is with a certain provision. But all of these things are qualitative, and the main point of them is that while benchmarking helps, to some extent, a next reviewer is likely to reach a different conclusion, because it's not easy to repeat the measurements with any kinds of certainty. On the other hand, the blue ones here towards the bottom, middle bottom of the screen, these are things that can be measured objectively and can be repeated, and more than one measurement will likely get the same result. So the simplest ones are binary ones, where you can look at a question and you look at what the implementer or the person being evaluated is doing, and you can objectively answer yes or no or true or false, or one of those. Then there's a measured value, which often requires a mechanism or a method or a test or something similar. You execute the test and it goes off and it does whatever it does, and it comes back and it says the answer is 0.42. Okay, and you write down the answer, and there may be benchmarks associated with it to say if it's above 50 or 0.5, it's good, and if it's under 0.5, it's not good. So that's typically a measured value. There's also this sort of idea of extent of compliance, where you have potentially a whole bunch of sub things that you're going to check, and then you have a very complicated mechanism of saying there are different weights in the hierarchy, and each of them contribute a little bit, and then I compute some kind of aggregate value for the level of or the extent of compliance. And then there's the idea of objective ranking, where you can put, and this works well for situations where you are looking at multiple evaluations at the same time, where you're saying, in a pairwise comparison, for instance, that organization B looks to be doing better at this than organization C, and you carry on with these pairwise comparisons until you've evaluated all the combinations, and that gives you a sort of objective ranking that's reasonably repeatable. And then increasingly nowadays we have classification methods that are somewhat of a hybrid, because we can teach machine learning algorithms with supervised or unsupervised classification, for instance, how to evaluate qualitative things in the way that a human would have done, and look at how they perform and say, yes, we agree with you on your assessment of this, and we disagree with you on your assessment of that. And the machine learning algorithm learns from us, how to process these things in future. So that's also potentially an option for us. Now, I've tried to make our work a little bit easier in a Mentimeter implementation by looking at these provisions and guessing whether I think it's measurable, number one, and whether I think one of these sort of methods might be appropriate for evaluating compliance. But as we go through each of them, you can now vote for the mechanisms that you think will be more appropriate for that kind of provision, and then we'll aggregate those results at the end and see if we can get all of it going. So I'm thinking that this should already be working. Everybody got the code? The code is there at the top. If you go to menti.com and type in that code, you should be able to access the questions. Everybody managed to get there? Uh, 6755-4663. Maybe that's a analog mechanism is better. Anybody struggling still to get in? Okay, let's give it another 30 seconds or so. We've got 3 people in by now. Four, 5. Must say I wouldn't call myself a Mentimeter expert, so. Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. 6. Okay, anybody that still wants to join that hasn't been able to? Everybody in? 8 of them. Okay, so let's kick off then. All right, so the first question then is about the Common Application Programming Interface. Especially if you're on a phone, you should be able to see a more detailed description of that criterion. And if you're using it on a PC, if you hover over that title, you should see that more detailed description. So the first provision in the policy for me is already somewhat problematic as a policy provision, because it's almost more like an objective or an aspiration that the policy must try and achieve. But nevertheless, I would think that one could potentially test whether some kind of common application programming interface is available by comparing it to some standard or specification. So for me, the typical measure here would be some kind of yes or no type of value to say, yeah, okay, if we have a specification, we can go and evaluate and compare the two and say, yes, it complies, or no, it doesn't. Or it could be potentially some measured value, I would think, in the sense that it may not implement all of the provisions of the API. For instance, many of these APIs have things like it has to support a whole range of error messages, and the API might not support all of them. Okay. Not sure whether this means that 2 has voted or 4 have voted. Okay. So I think we're 18 total. So 3 votes remaining. Ah, 9 votes. So the audience is growing. Okay, the next one. Is that it should be supporting a wide variety of applications. Now again, this is very high level and sort of fuzzily stated, because I couldn't really think of a way in which you can objectively evaluate whether somebody's actually complying with this provision. So the way they state it is that PID services for EOSC needs to address a wide variety of applications, including those that require secure mechanisms built into the PID infrastructure. And by the way, some of the things that you can choose is to say, no, none of these sort of types of measures is applicable. And at the end of the survey, we will give you a chance to maybe share ideas on other types of applications. Or you can say that, no, you don't think this is measurable. The task force has got to think about it again. Yeah, so other is potentially useful. A simple review might work, that's true. You know, it's a very fuzzy concept, so you can evaluate it fuzzily, which is not is not ideal, but it will work. You know, some human can now go and have a look and say, yeah, I like it or I don't.
Perhaps the functionality of a PID is quite well described. It's known what it should do, and the rest should just be left out of the scope.
Yeah.
So, you know, a wide variety of applications, but those that require a PID.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so it's difficult to say, okay, but how does one actually... It's again, for me, almost more like the preamble to a policy to say these are our objectives. We want PIDs to be used in a wide variety of applications, including ones that require secure application.
Then it's not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
Or a magic
Maybe it
hammer
should be
that
more
you can use
specific.
for every name.
Yeah. So one of the choices that you have is to say, no, send it back. They need to refine this. They need to restate it or think about how to improve the way in which they present it to us. Okay, next. Each PID should have a clear owner. So this is now to do with, yes, I have a persistent identifier for my document or data set or a journal article that I have published. But how do I know who the owner of that PID is? How do we evaluate that? And by the way, the measures remain the same, but I thought it would be less boring if we present the results a little bit differently each time. So that's why it changes. Yeah. So this, for me, if I can try and influence you a little bit, I think this is something that you can measure directly with some test. You should be able to go to the resolution or the hosting authority for that persistent identifier and check whether the owners are explicitly known. Whether those owners' information are publicly visible is, of course, a different question, because it might not be in compliance with privacy regulations and so on to tell people who the owner of a PID is.
So which service tells you the owner of the PID?
So let's say I've registered a data set with DataSite. So what this says is if you're evaluating compliance with a policy, you should be able to go to DataSite to say who's the owner of this PID, which in the case of DataSite you can do because it's explicit on their website who owns which DOIs. But it might not be true of all of them. But we're not worried about let's say, the nuances of privacy, for instance. We're just worried about the technicalities of establishing beyond doubt that you can determine the owner.
Without having a meaning of what ownership means.
Yeah. Yes, I suppose. Because the person who requested that DOI to be created, I suppose, is the owner.
But that's, what rights does the owner have?
Yeah.
Legal rights, technical rights.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And it also depends on how many billions.
Yes.
there are.
Yes, if it's a finely granulated PID that people use for almost like hashes to uniquely identify little bits and pieces of stuff, then doesn't actually matter much.
It can.
Yeah. Well, yes, because otherwise there's orphans that you can't say who's supposed to look after this.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the outputs that we get, of course, from this survey is to go back to the task force and say the kinds of ways in which people think we should measure this is all over the place, which is also good feedback, because if they can narrow down the formulation of the provision, then maybe there will be fewer ways in which people think it can be measured.
There's also important that when the PID owner changes, it has to be possible to update and maintain this
Yeah.
information that it has the right of ownership.
Which is actually not a provision at the moment. So maybe if it's not picked up in the other breakout, that's something that maybe to add to convey to Jessica, to add to things that require refinement.
Yeah, this is not even changing the owner, but sharing the ownership, and maybe on the PID level, but also on the namespace level.
Yes.
It's extremely complicated. And
Yes.
it's an open question, which is not that easy to answer.
Yeah.
There's use case for this.
Yeah. Yeah, because in some PID services, there is no way to look at, let's say, prefixes or anything like that to determine who minted that persistent identifier. It'll have to be stored in the kernel information somehow and be retrievable from there potentially. Yeah. Okay. The owner manages the PID properly. This is really complex. How do we know that they're doing what's expected of them? So what I thought of doing is to look for a range of update dates, last update dates across a whole range of persistent identifiers. But that, I don't know whether that actually tells you anything, because some of them might be very stable. I mean, if you have long-term data sets with a persistent identifier and nothing changes in terms of ownership of that data set, then nothing's going to change in the persistent identifier either.
You can always test whether it still resolves. If it
Yes.
doesn't, it's not properly maintained.
Sure, but that's slightly different. That's a resolution test, which comes later. This is whether the owner actually has the capacity and the capability and the intent to maintain the persistent identifier.
If you just update the data package, so you might have different checksum, but checksum is not part of the identifier. So
Yeah.
you realize it's a new data package. It's
Yeah.
still resolved, but it's not. And then also the question is the data is a PID owner or is the data owner?
No, most cases not.
No.
It's not,
Yeah. So this is something like says dance on behalf of a depositor gets a persistent identifier from DataSite, and we link it to the metadata. And the resolution happens to the metadata page. But now if the owner of that deposit comes to us and says they want to add a file, or whoever looks after the metadata, that name is changed and so on, we update DataSite with that change in the metadata associated with the PID. But not everybody does that. And for me, this is how I read it, the proper management of the PID. It's very difficult to measure, in my view, because some packages just never will need an update. So you can't just go and look at the frequency of update, because it's meaningless in this sense. So a very complicated one to measure this, I think.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
could this be also part of, as I interpret this, on the service level management? So is this related to service management? Because there are rules, like
Yeah.
in FitSM you have rules. What is a proper way of managing the service?
Yes, there are rules, but you don't know whether the rules are ever needed to be followed if there are no changes to the package.
But that's about the auditing. So the auditor comes, checks, it's behind your screen, checks, okay, you have it documented, you do it right, okay, flag, done. But it's a guided review.
Yeah. And it's then some kind of a subjective review by a human,
Right.
one way or another.
Just like audit basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. We have to move on, I suppose. Support multiple granularity levels. That's also. I mean, how do you verify this? Multiple levels of granularity should be supported by the PID ecosystem. So the only way I thought you could measure this is to say, at some point in the future in EOSC, we have 10 or 20 or however many PID services that are being used by the community. We need to check across all of them whether they support a wide range of granularity. What else can we say about this? I don't know that. We can't go and test, because the services are often focused on just one level of granularity, a data set or a publication or a vocabulary element or whatever the case may be. So they're not providing a whole range of granularity within that service. It's more of a collective assessment, the way I think about it at the moment. Or I would even tick a box somewhere to say, no, go back to the drawing board and think about this again. Is there not a different set of provisions which will obtain the same objective but is more measurable?
You're probably likely to get different PIDs at different levels.
Yes. Yes.
So it could be a network.
Yeah, and I mean, in dance, we are now starting to investigate that situation too, because you have a situation where for some levels of granularity, you need a lot of governance of that service. But for a very fine level of granularity, you probably don't need a lot of governance. So things like governance and how the community works with that persistent identifier and so on are all dependent on the granularity. Okay. Any more votes coming? Okay, the community, this is even more complicated. The levels of granularity appropriate to community best practice and use cases should be provided while allowing for flexibility to respond. So, I mean, the only way that I can think of measuring this, but again, it's across all services then and not for a specific one, is to say these are EOSC community use cases that require PIDs, and here is the mapping to the PID services that can potentially satisfy those use cases. Can't think of any other way to measure this. So yes, it's maybe a question of saying once a year some expert must go and look at the landscape and tell us what's going on.
Whom are we evaluating then?
Yeah, because these provisions are tied to actors. And this is now something that they expect of the PID provider actor. But I think you can't measure it from a specific PID provider because they are focusing on just one aspect of what the community needs. You have to measure it across all the PID providers. So one of the feedback points that I think we should add, at least from my perspective, is to say some of these things, they do apply to that actor in the policy, but they can only be measured across all the actors. You can't measure it for a specific actor. You have to check what each of them are doing and then aggregate the result to get the answer. Okay, so I think this is most certainly either something to be reworked or some qualitative assessment at the current point in time. Okay, it must support versioning. Now this has to do not with the PID services such as DataSite or ORCID or whatever, but by the people who mint the DOIs such as DANS. So there's a wide variety of practices, but I think there's also good guidance. One of the rules that we've come up at DANS is, for instance, to say that it's a reproducibility test. If you can reproduce the outputs generated from a data set, even though they make some amendments and refinements to it, then it doesn't need a new PID, but it has a minor version increment for that persistent identifier. But if you cannot reproduce results that may have already been citing that data set from the changes, you have to create a new persistent identifier and point back to the original. So that I think can fairly objectively be measured if you are very precise about it and say any change to the data set requires a new PID. You can just compare checksums. So if the checksum changes, new PID. But there are sort of nuances for us, because if somebody just goes and says, I'm adding some community vocabulary classification of an arbitrary dimension that I've had in the data to make it more useful, you can still produce any output that you generated previously from that data set. It doesn't change any published results from that data set, but it will change the checksum.
But then DataSite, for instance, provides room for this in
Yes.
the DataSite with the kernel standard.
Yes, but they
That is used
is up to the provider of the, not the service, but somebody like the repository that mints the. Yes, exactly.
So how would you evaluate DataSite? DataSite is fine.
Yeah, so their metadata makes provision for recording these relations. That's true, but it's up to the PID. I think what's it called? The PID provider. Yeah. the PID provider to figure that out. Yeah. Okay, PID should not be reassigned or deleted. Verifying whether something has been reassigned is not very easy to do. In fact, I think it's impossible. But verifying that there's a tombstone, if a data set or the object being described by the PID is no longer active, that can be done. I think actually they should reformulate this, because you cannot delete the PID. You can delete the object that it is referring to, right? And then you must have a tombstone or some explanation as to why that object is not available any longer. But I don't think you can measure the fact that it has been deleted in the registry of the service providing the PIDs, and it's very complicated, I think, to do so. And I think it needs to be reformulated.
You can have a couple of examples of a tombstone that's done right. But then the question is this being done consistently?
Yes. And can you evaluate it automatically, which you probably cannot do. Yeah. So it'll at the moment you'll still have to go and check whether it's being done through manual checking of some kind. And finding examples that you can verify is going to be almost impossible. You can ask people to point to their policy or their workflow.
Yeah, just came to my mind that actually there's one case when you're using Zenodo, for instance, and you submit your either data or software, and then you realize that actually I committed the wrong stuff.
Yes.
So it happened to us a couple of times when we were publishing these things, and we had to withdraw. So basically we pinged the Zenodo people, and they just deleted the stuff, but that PID obviously stays there,
yes,
but it's not available. So basically they can trace it back because it's your email.
Yeah.
You can just basically count how many people did the same thing. So it's measurable.
Yeah. But there's also this let's say element of best practice, because Zenodo shouldn't really let's say make that PID inaccessible. It should resolve to a tombstone, because it may have been cited, and now if you follow up on that citation, there's nothing to find. It's disappeared. So the tombstone best practice, I think, is necessary. You will have cases where this is a dud, or there's a mistake, or whatever the case would be. But then the best practice is it must still resolve, but you must find information about where to find the updated data set, for instance, in the tombstone, rather than just nothing resolves. Yeah. Okay, I think this has taken over. Some AI at Mentimeter has decided to move the show ahead. Some timer, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, the next question, information about on the referenced object. So I think that in basic terms, this of course is very true, because we would want to get all kinds of information about that object via the resource that it resolves to, the PID resolves to. But what you get there is very, very broad at the current point in time. So there's all kinds of discussions about standardizing it in respect of, for instance, FAIR, and many ideas about that. There are discussions about what you should find there in terms of reproducibility, which is sort of related to FAIR but not exactly the same. I think in broad terms this is true, but you'll have to have more detail about what exactly you expect in terms of that information, because otherwise you can't really measure it properly or evaluate it properly. So I think one can even go as far as to say that if they can come up with some minimum profile for FAIR-related links or information, and reproducibility-related information, and a few other considerations from the community, then you can measure to what extent that landing page or target for the resolution provides you with the information that you might need. Yeah, and then of course there are all kinds of other ideas about this. In some cases people want to move some of this information to the PID kernel and say it's not authoritative, but that then gets out of sync potentially with what you find at the resolution target, and you've got to track that somehow, whether it should be updated or not. So yes, I think it can be objectively measured, but how to measure it, I think, is not so clear. Any more votes coming? Strong ideas one way or the other? By the way, we're making good progress. I'm very encouraged. Okay, PIDs can identify many different entities. They can be born digital. It can be document software services. Yeah, that's true, but you actually need to measure it. I don't think so. The use cases that we have in our landscape and our ecosystem will ask for PIDs for certain kinds of applications. And as we've seen in one of those previous situations, we can go and try with some kind of an periodic review to see whether the supply of PID types and granularity matches the expectations of the community. But that's more or less what you can do. Yeah?
The question here is whether one PID can identify several types of entities at the same time, or if it's one type group of PID can identify different types.
Good point, because some PIDs can be applied to many types of digital output, software and code and data sets and publications, but others are very specific. And I don't know whether they are actually asking us if the same PID can serve multiple use cases or purposes.
I think it was just raised yesterday that the DOI can point to a PDF of the publication, a text file of the publication, and to many different multimedia with just a single identifier.
Yes. Yeah, that's slightly different again, because if the information in those different formats are the same, exactly the same, lossless conversion, then that's basically almost just like content negotiation to say, I want this not as a PDF but a text file. And that I think is without question the same DOI.
So it's not the case of the concept DOI, for instance. If you have concept DOI in Zenodo, let's say you have a data set X, the concept DOI does not tell which version, and each version has then DOI.
Yeah.
So which interpretation was that actually?
No, so I think it's up to the requester of the persistent identifier to decide whether they want a new version. And then there comes a sort of a provenance requirement to say ideally you want to point back to other versions of the same data or earlier versions of the same data so that you can find them. So you can make the PIDs finer if you want, but then you have some kind of a provenance burden to satisfy, to link them all together. If you do it differently and say I've got one persistent identifier for all the different format variations of the same thing, but the content in them is exactly the same, you don't have to worry about the provenance and the linking. But that's pretty much up to the person providing the PIDs to depositors, for instance, to figure out how they want to do it. And Zenodo works very differently, for instance, from Dataverse, repository software in that regard, as an example. Both are defensible, but they don't work the same.
I think this picture right now shows a bit that we, or at the side, don't really get the point, or we have really complete different opinions and meanings, understandings of the problem.
Yes.
So we all need different things.
Yes, agree.
Pretty much evenly distributed, so there is no peak in anything.
Yes.
Could maybe also suggest that another option could be clarification or need to be reformulated. Several like that.
I figured out what's happening here is if everybody has voted, it moves to the next one automatically. Yeah. Yeah, that's, I think, obvious, I suppose, but okay. Yeah, so I think we need to feedback also these cases where there's no consensus amongst us about how to measure it, because it means it's not clear what we are measuring or what is meant by the policy provision. Okay, the representation via digital representation, such as a landing page, metadata, attribute set, and so on, and have a presence in the digital landscape. All digital representations should be fair. I watered down this without permission because it actually says fair digital objects. And I think that's a bit too specific. As long as it can be determined to be fair, I think how and when is determined by what the community implements. If only some of them implement a fair digital object approach, you still want to go and measure other ones that are implementing it differently. And until there are clear specifications and guidelines and widespread adoption of a few approaches to ensuring fair, I think one will have to keep it a little bit more open. So it makes it more difficult to evaluate. We cut our teeth with a Fuji tool in the FAIR project that tries to automatically determine whether a data set is fair or not. And there are many impediments to this.
You have to be careful not to price to the meta level.
Yeah.
So having metadata on the metadata is probably not that useful.
No. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, I would say. Let's see how far we get before Jessica and the exiles return. Okay, any more votes outstanding? No? Okay, kernel information profiles. The policy wants us to have at least a minimum set of attributes in the kernel information. I think that's fine if they can define what it is and the community agrees that this is what's in there, perfectly cool. And it's directly measurable in my view. So this is not problematic at all. If there's a spec of what should be in there, we can check whether it's there and say yes or no. So there's probably a little bit of plumbing and gymnastics required to evaluate it against the requirements of the community, because it means you have to know that this PID was issued for a community and that the profile for that community looks like this. But still, from a measurement perspective, if you have that, it's straightforward to measure.
If you know the community, you can use there, right?
The?
You know the community.
Yes, that's why I say. So it is a lot of work actually to get it to work in terms of getting communities to define the profiles. But if they have done so, it's straightforward to measure.
Could be
Yeah, so maybe that's a very good suggestion, is to say the community, you must reference the specification in the kernel, and then the measurement is very straightforward. Very good plan. Okay.
The XML namespace.
Yeah. Okay. The kernel information is non-authoritative. Sven and I discussed this some months ago. Say, what's the point if it's not authoritative? Even you have to go somewhere else to find it. I suppose if it's quicker and easier, and you can somehow easily check whether it still needs an update.
We have to find the authors of the document to understand what the meaning of this is.
Yeah, so I would say the kernel information should be stuff, well, that's just my opinion, but I would think the kernel information must be standardized, but it doesn't have to be duplicating what the metadata for that object provides you, right? Because that you can get from the landing page, and that's authoritative. So these are potentially more things like which community are you serving and stuff that might not be in the metadata. Who's the owner, and so on.
But the kernel metadata should help you distinguish this object from all the other ones. So you need to have the specific information there.
Yeah, but to what degree it should now duplicate all kinds of domain and discipline specific metadata? Probably not. So there's a border between the two that needs to be figured out by the community in consensus.
About the non-authoritative thing, that basically, so what you in the example you said, if you in dance have to say modify data, you would have to submit this also to the data side.
Yes.
So you also have to say two different sources, basically the same information.
Yeah.
So if you have current information profile data, then of course you have the process to make sure that this is somehow updated.
Yes.
Similar as in your example. So this should be part of the policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Process behind.
Yes.
To make it valuable.
Yes, and maybe the policy should focus more on the processes and not so much on the content. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to cut it short because we've run out of time. We have probably about 3 or so that we haven't evaluated, but anything that we could achieve is better than nothing. So thanks very much. So Jessica, I don't know if you want to give quick feedback on what happened while you were in exile.
Yeah, good. And also, maybe if you could go back to the slide, the joint chiefs officer, that one.
Yeah.
So if you want to, still we have the concept board where you can make virtual comments on the.
It's point in the PID Policy.
Sorry?
It's point in the PID Policy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there you can make comments on the consent requirements. Yeah, I think we had good discussions. Nice questions and yeah. We will have some data to continue and the discussions on how and yeah, I think there was both that we maybe shouldn't be meddling so much so deep in the structures, but on the other hand there was this also the idea that well it would be good with more clear guidelines and practices and documentation on how PIDs are implemented in contexts.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say we veered between confusion and epiphany. Some were easy and some were really insightful, but there are others where we had great difficulty figuring how it can be measured or whether it's relevant at all, but we'll give you all of that feedback. We didn't manage to get through all of them. There's 3 or so, I think, that we didn't get round to voting on, but we'll find another way to get feedback, potentially broadening the survey to a wider community to get additional input, with the insights that we've got from here, what kind of questions to ask and what kind of background to provide to the survey respondents. Okay, so our next steps then. In FAIRCORE4EOSC, we will write a short workshop report. That's one of our milestones. But the main aim really is to provide input into a deliverable that's due towards spring next year, which is essentially a conceptual model, a framework for compliance assessment that describes the services, the methods, the vocabularies that are needed. And in there, these inputs are important because we need to try and classify the things that are going to be measured into different kinds and say, this needs a review assessment, this needs a measurement via test, this can be evaluated automatically by comparing things in the web and so on. So we're hoping to complete that work by spring next year. That's our target. And we'll of course include feedback from the other breakout, from Fair Impact, into this conceptual model definition and thinking about what it should be able to do and what it should be able to represent. Fair Impact, I think, also probably needs to write a workshop report and then confirm maybe we can secretly do the same report. No. We can each write a chapter in the report. Yeah. Okay. Confirm the scope and content of policy provisions and criteria, and the scope of the actors and roles in very broad terms. And then both of these, of course, go back to the task force and say, from the exchanges we've had here and the inputs we've received, these are things that we think need refinement or adjustment or a bit more thinking, whichever way.
Yeah. Certainly, and we would also share for community review on this one.
Yeah.
We will make some. This was a very, very good group, but quite small.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll of course have to cast the net wider. Yeah, no doubt.
So, and then you can also see whether we understood you or misunderstood.
Okay, so it remains to me to thank you very much for holding out to the bitter end.